Welcome back to the NWA 1983 project. I'm your host, Lex G, and with me this evening once again is Matt Riley. How you doing tonight, Matt?
I'm super.
Super duper. Doing big things, I hope.
Oh, yeah. Super big.
So tonight on the show, it's a very interesting show for us. It'll be our first national show. This will take place on ESPN, mid-83. Tonight we will have, again, it's all main event tonight, folks. Terry Funk versus Bad News Allen. Dusty Rhodes versus Tiger Jeet Singh. Abbullah the Butcher versus Andre the Giant. Stan Hansen versus Bruiser Brody. And Ric Flair versus Harley Race in a non-title match. Very important. So I really want to get into cable television, the advent of cable television at this time in 1983. It's still in its infancy. As most of you know, basically the first cable network was WTBS out of Atlanta, Georgia. Ted Turner that linked up to the satellite in 1972. But still at this time, it was really still kind of small, still very regionalized. You weren't having the total national penetration at this point. And one of the reasons I chose ESPN was at the time, ESPN was still, very young, still a lot of bowling shows, still a lot of fishing shows, and they didn't have a lot of content. So I figure if we're going to go national, we start with ESPN because we know, because we have the benefit of foresight on this, that they're going to become a juggernaut, starting in the late 80s, early 90s, and exploding into the 2000s.
Yeah.
Now I just want to give you the overall landscape of basically how television worked back in 1983. I can speak on this personally. In New York, there wasn't a whole lot of channels. Again, cable wasn't readily available. So here in New York, you had Channel 2, which was CBS, Channel 4, which was NBC, Channel 7, which was ABC, and then we had WPIX, which was Channel 11, WWOR, which was Channel 9. So basically, it was from 1 to 13. We also got Channel 55, which was a local station. In terms of cable, other than that, again, not a whole lot of stuff there. What were some of the channels over by you in the Boston area?
In the Boston area, we had the cable had WGN out of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
We had WOR. We had PIX because I could watch the Mets games, the Yankees games on different channels.
Nice.
I remember that because I could watch like a Cubs game, a Yankees game, a Mets game. I don't think I saw the White Sox, but wrestling-wise, it opened a lot of doors that way.
Oh, definitely.
And of course, there was like this random network, like the Financial News Network, which would play for some reason on Friday nights at midnight, like Memphis wrestling.
Yeah.
I think there's other channels local. Like we had believe it or not, independent wrestling up here. So you had New England Championship Wrestling. You had IWC Internet or ICW, International Championship Wrestling, which was just terrible. It's funny because a lot of the time it's like it is nowadays, but a little bit. I think you'd see bigger stars, but doing more.
Right.
As opposed to now where it's like one big star comes in and fights the champion or the big name talent. Back then you had I'm trying to think of random stars, but Sergeant Slaughter would do a show, and bring 3 or 4 guys with him. People wise though, I always remember the early days. You mentioned ESPN and bowling. It would be you'd watch AWA or WCCW or whatever wrestling they put on, and then it would be monster trucks.
Yeah.
There's always monster trucks.
Fly fishing, and then they have skeet shooting, and they would have their sports center, but they really didn't have a whole lot in terms of your big time sports. They did get the NBA later. They did get NFL. Obviously, they have them now, but early on, I think they had a lot of of the NCAA stuff was the kind of the thing that kept them going for a long time.
Yeah.
Now the way that a lot of these promotions, especially the territory promotions, they had local TV. Now they did have local TV on your network affiliates. So in different areas of the country, the way television works, and to the extent it still works that way today, you would have your network shows, which would basically be all primetime. Your news, your 6 o'clock news, your 7 o'clock news, your 10 or 11 o'clock news, your late show. They would have a morning news program and maybe one talk show in the morning. The rest of the day was basically filled up with game shows and reruns and that kind of stuff. And it still kind of works that way today.
Yeah.
A lot of these promotions were able to get with an NBC affiliate or a CBS affiliate and put their wrestling show, either at midnight or at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday or a random Tuesday at 6. So basically that's how television worked. locally.
Yeah.
Now, when Vince came in with the national syndication, he would go into a lot of these towns, a lot of these cities, and actually pay off the television companies or networks or stations, and they would take their time slots. So if you were watching, Mid-South Wrestling at 11 o'clock on Saturdays, Vince came in there with superstars, gave them more money. They took Mid-South off and put superstars on instead.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the overall scope of cable television, the channels you had around that time were obviously ESPN. Your Disney Channel was launching later on this year. You had TBS. You had the Nashville Network, which most people know as Spike TV today.
Yeah.
You have your Playboy channels. You had your HBOs and some of your premium paid channels as well. And the funny thing about HBO, again, coming out of New York, from 1973 to 1977, they ran Madison Square Garden house shows on HBO, which is amazing to me. I do want to go back and check out some of those shows. And if you guys see it on YouTube, please link it to this video. I would definitely want to check those out because those are interesting to me. Another interesting thing about television in the 80s was the deregulation of television overall. Now, what deregulation did was you were able to have sponsored shows. Now, in the 60s and 70s, you couldn't pay for a show. The network would have to put the show on and sell advertisement. What deregulation did, you were able to put on a infomercial. So you have your Tony Littles or your Denise Austins on there.
Tony Little.
Some of these late nights, and it kind of took away some of the time slots for pro wrestling because a lot of these companies, hey, we'll give you a tape and this money, you just run it, and you don't have to sell any advertising, and that's how that went. So I think deregulation, in the mid '80s, late '80s, would have you kind of hurt, wrestling in terms of their time slots. Mm-hmm. But if you had a strong wrestling show, like obviously your 6:05 Saturday, night wrestling wasn't going to go anywhere because it was so strong. It was the thing that carried Ted Turner during the lean years. So the biggest thing is, if you have a network or you have a cable channel, you should definitely consider putting wrestling on your channel because, since the inception of television, now wrestling was on network television in the 50s on the Dumont network. Mm-hmm. And it was there for about 10 years until the early 60s. When the early 60s happened, basically there was no more wrestling on network television. And it still pretty much remains that to this day, until the advent of Saturday Night's Main Event. There was no wrestling, especially in prime time. There was no wrestling on any networks. Now they were all on network affiliates at enough odd time slots, throughout the week or in the weekend. Now, one of the big things they had in the 80s, before pay-per-view, was closed circuit events. Now, what a closed circuit event is it is your modern day equivalent to a pay-per-view. So they would put on Antonio Inoki versus Muhammad Ali, and you would go to your local, theater, small arena, and they would put this show up on a big screen, and you would watch it with 100 or 200 other fans in this arena. Now, I've never been to a closed circuit event, but those do seem like a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I always compare it now. It's sort of if you go to the Hooters or the sports bar to see a boxing match or UFC, you get that live crowd that's really into it. I actually watched when I was in Georgia, the Phillies and Phillies in Toronto World Series.
Nice.
And that was a really hot crowd. I never had the pleasure of going to watch a quote-unquote closed circuit, though.
Because I knew they used to sell out like the annex next door to the Greensboro Coliseum. They would do Radio City Music Hall, Madison Square Garden if they had overflow, and they would watch it there. So again, the closed circuit is a really interesting concept to me. And as we go through the year, we're going to have closed circuit events. The first one being Wrestling from the Chase from St. Louis, which will be coming up very shortly. So Matt, tell me about the first big event pay-per-view that you ever saw.
I want to say it's either one of the Bunkhouse Stampedes from NWA.
Okay. Live from Nassau Coliseum, by the way.
Right, yeah.
30 minutes away from my house.
Right. The other would have been one of my favorite pay-per-views of all time, only because of the main event, Super Clash 3.
I think you would say Wrestle Rock, but okay.
Yeah, no. Well, Super Clash 3 was the NWA's attempt to kind of break ground, I guess. The matches on it weren't very memorable. I actually looked them up, but Embry versus Jarrett when Jarrett didn't know how to lift weights.
Yep.
Iceman King Parsons versus Brickhouse Brown. It was kind of a mix of Memphis, AWA, and CCW. And the idea was the main event was Lawler, the AWA champion, versus Kerry Von Erich, which is the WCWA champion. And it was this unification match, and Kerry Von Erich bled insanely amount. It was so much blood. I remember my parents, they let me get the pay-per-view, and my friends came over to watch it, and he bled so much. And the line that stands out of my mind is, I want to say Frank Dusek was in his corner.
Okay.
And for Kerry Von Erich's corner, is sort of like, the representative. And Lawler was just, I think he hit him with like a roll of nickels and like busted Kerry open. And he's bleeding like crazy. And the referee keeps checking Kerry. And I mean, blood's just pouring out of him. I mean, like, it's dripping all over the mat. Like he hit a gusher. The ref's like, I'm going to stop the match. And Frank Dusek's like, no, he's fine. He bleeds all the time. And my dad just cracked up. He just, and we all laughed. It was such a he's fine, But yeah, it was one of those things that just, that memory of that bloody, bloody match and them awarding the match and the titles to Lawler. It was a really cool, if you want to call it, screw job finish, but still, had some heat to it,
I mean, it's a little bit of a dusty finish on that.
Right, but I remember the main event. It's funny because it has the main event listed here was Rock and Roll Express versus the Stud Stable. And I'm like, wow, I forgot that was the main event because like after a match like that, you're like, wow, that was one more match, okay.
I'm surprised they put that on last. I wonder why.
I would guess they probably just had it as like they weren't sure how many time, the TV time,
right? And
they figured, well, if we don't get that in, I would have done something like Slaughter fought Colonel De Beers in a boot camp match. I would have taken something like that, or Greg Gagne beat Ron Garvin by counter in a AWA TV title match. Keep that and have it be like a last second, like, you know what? We have some time. We're gonna have one more match. I want to face you for your title, but they don't think that way nowadays. Oh, and don't forget the Top Guns, Ricky Rice and Derek Dukes with Wendy Ricker defeating Bad Company, Paul Diamond, Pat Tanaka, and Medusa Michelli with Diamond Dallas Page. DDP.
No, the attendance for that show was 1,672 people.
Was it really?
Yeah, at the UFC Pavilion,
no!
Chicago. Yeah.
No, that's all?
Yeah. I can't find the buy rate on it, but I can only imagine what the buy rate was on it. Because they probably didn't have nationwide penetration.
I don't remember the crowd being hot or not back then. Like, I will say that back when I was really into like the areas, the wrestling I wanted to watch the most was Pacific Northwest because I got this newsletter. I used to get wrestling newsletters. Yep. It's probably a different show topic to discuss, but
absolutely.
I used to get newsletters from around the country from different wrestling guys that wrote newsletters. So like back when Wade Keller first was doing the Wrestling Torch, I actually wrote a couple articles for him way back in the day.
Really awesome.
Which I recently found. But what was cool was like we had the Pacific Northwest, and it was just so cool reading about like Art Bar, Beetlejuice, and all this stuff, and Controlled Mayhem with all the wrestling out of Memphis and Tennessee. Man, but like, the first for me was Super Clash 3, and then I think it was Bunkhouse. I remember being pissed Dusty won.
Yeah.
And not so much that it was like, oh, it's Dusty, but more the case of like, give somebody else that you don't need the win.
Can you explain to everyone what the Bunkhouse Stampede was? Because it's a
really
interesting concept.
If you're like, what's a Bunkhouse Stampede? It's kind of like a battle royal, except you wear street clothes, so like jeans, boots, things you'd wear to a bunkhouse. Now maybe you're saying, okay, I get that we're at a bunkhouse, but what's a bunkhouse? A bunkhouse is a building offering basic sleeping accommodations for workers, visitors, or campers. So the idea theoretically was you were taking all the guys working on the farm and having them have a brawl to see who the toughest one was. And who would think more about farms and brawling than in New York, in Nassau Coliseum?
Yeah. And again, we have no idea what a bunkhouse is. So
yeah, and I think you can bring weapons into it. I remember guys always had like steel chairs and belts and crap.
They take their boot off and wax
it.
Right.
Boot. And Dusty won, I think, every year they did it.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things, and again, I always look back to like when I think of like wrestling and mistakes they made and not building up stars, like even talking about wrestling today, they're missing the boat, giving like a big star who already is established a big win like that, Like, yeah, they gave Big Show the Under the Giant Battle Royal. Okay, he's the Big Show. He makes sense. But you wouldn't give it to like John Cena, Like Royal Rumble now should always go to somebody new or somebody who's going to put a spin on it.
Oh, I definitely agree there. Now, a couple of funny tidbits about the Bunkhouse Stampede. Again, I've watched the show a million times because, again, it's very local to me, so it has a special place in my heart. But
Yeah.
apparently, everyone that was in the Bunkhouse Stampede had to win another Bunkhouse Stampede that was on a house show that
Oh,
no one
really? I
saw.
remember that.
So, yeah, so like the Barbarian won one. I think Tully's in it, Luger's in it, and I think Ivan Koloff's in it, and a couple of random dudes in there. Another thing too is when they promoted the show, they had the wrong time on the tickets. So if you watch the first two matches, there's no one in the Coliseum because they didn't know that
Oh,
the show was at 7 o'clock and not 8 o'clock. So there was a
now
misprint on the
that's
tickets. So if you watch like your Larry Zbyszko versus Barry Windham for the Western States Heritage Championship, you'll see no one in the building.
wow.
Yeah.
That's classic Crockett.
It's like, ooh. And you're trying to run New York in Vince's backyard again. Not good stuff whatsoever. Not a
God.
good idea.
Wow.
And they've ran New York a couple times. They would run New Meadowlands every once in a while. They used to have they had a great Steamboat versus Flair match. I think in '84, right before Steamboat left.
Yeah. It's just funny. I remember the whole series, but there were 4 of them, and guess who won all 4 of them?
Dusty.
Like, dude, like,
He's the bull of the woods.
and that's the thing. I think that's the problem. And I always say, like, when it comes to like bookers and having a booker versus promoter, type mentality or like creative team, I always look back like when I was interviewed for WWE on the phone, and the guy was like, "Well, do you want us to consider you for on-air talent or creative team? You can't be both."
Right.
And that was because I'm sure that the Dusty rule, you don't want to be booking yourself. But as egos go, like, it's like one of those things if you go to a house show local, and let's say the show is run by, this is quite going back to the old days, but, you go to a house show, and then let's say, superstar Billy Bob is the champion, and he defeats the big challenger, and then they have a battle royal, and superstar Billy Bob wins it,
Yeah.
And it's like, it's, whatever. Did they say what the attendance was live? I missed that number.
$6,000.
So, okay, so right there, 3 times what they had for the Super Clash 3.
Yeah. I'm assuming if Super Clash 3 was from the Mid-South Coliseum, they would have sold it out.
Right, and that's the thing is, I think I understand why they did a quote-unquote neutral territory for like both wrestlers, but man, talk about dropping the ball, like do it in a hot city.
With Memphis, with Jerry Lawler in Memphis, finally winning the big one in the Mid-South Coliseum, becoming the world heavyweight champion, that place would have exploded. But doing it at Chicago, I'm not even sure how many people in Memphis actually watched that show. They would have to wait till next Saturday to find out that Jerry Lawler won the belt. It's not good business. Not good business.
No.
Now, one of the first pay-per-views that I ordered personally that I had purchased myself, and I had taped it too with the VCR. We can get into what VCRs were, kids, in a little bit. Was Great American Bash 1991.
Ooh.
Which is historically known as one of the worst pay-per-views of all time. Now, the big controversy with this show was this is when Ric Flair left to go to WWF, and he was still the NWA champion at the time. So what they did is they had the number 1 contender, which was Lex Luger, the United States champion, versus Barry Windham to have a new world champion, right? And they didn't even have a belt, so they had to use Dusty's old Florida Tag Team Championship belt to represent the World Championship before they had a new belt made. And they had it in the cage, and they did the turn where Luger hit Windham with the pile driver, and Harley Race came out.
And what did he say? He said, "Now's the time." Which my friends and I still use that all the time when we're trying to do something. Now's the time. Also on that show.
Are you gonna talk about it? You gonna talk about it? Okay.
No, underrated tag match. Steve Austin, Terrence Taylor versus PN News and Bobby Eaton.
A scaffold match.
Was it really?
Yeah, scaffold match.
No.
Yeah, it's the first show on the card.
Wow.
We have to watch. Maybe one day we'll do a review of that entire show. But yeah, it's PN News, Bobby Eaton versus Austin and Terry Taylor in a scaffold match. In addition, they had the Freebirds with Bad Street versus the Young Pistols and Dustin Rhodes. I believe there's a Ron Simmons versus Oz match on that show. Z-Man versus Scott Hall, who was a Diamond Stud at the time. I believe you had a wrestler called Black Blood versus Big Josh, who became Doink the Clown.
Oh, Big Josh.
Yeah, he was a lumberjack, folks, and yeah, it was ridiculous. He was from the Pacific Northwest. That's where they built him from. So those are like one of those shows that I've watched a million times because I had taped it, off the television. So I literally had that entire show memorized. That one and Royal Rumble '89 was the other show that I had on tape that I watched all the time as a kid.
Wow.
Yeah, Great American Bash '91.
Yeah, I want to say that was the one I watched at my friend Sean's house, and his mother. Again, it was now's the time.
Yep.
But the best was watching wrestling with Sean's mom because she was from, I think, Barbados.
Oh, she bought it.
Oh, she bought it like, oh, you leave Dusty and Rhodes alone. But oh my God, the Horsemen, why you do that? Like every time they came in and like stormed the ring, I used to always laugh because I had a roommate for a while who, like a couple years ago, who would watch wrestling with me every so often, be like, dude, this is stupid. Come on, and he'd get angrier and angrier as it got on. Which I always say is the great when a market's all like, it's like, this is wrestling stupid, man, it's stupid. And then they start buying into it. Yeah. Well, why is that guy running in? Why are they stopping him?
Also, the main event of that show wasn't the title match.
No?
The main event of that show was Missy Hyatt and Rick Steiner versus Arn Anderson and Paulie Dangerously was the main event.
What?
Yeah. And then before the match started, Dick Murdoch and Dick Slater came out and stole Missy Hyatt. So it was basically a handicap match with Rick Steiner versus Arn Anderson and Paul Lee as the main event. Yeah, not a good show. Not the worst show, but not a good show. In addition, you had the Yellow Dog, who was Brian Pillman versus Johnny B. Bad. And the funniest part of that entire match was Brian Pillman walks up to the camera and he says, "Johnny, don't be bad. Johnny, be gay." And it's audible. You can hear it. And it's still on network. I looked for it. I'm like, oh, boy, this is awesome.
Wow.
Oh, you also had your Ricky Morton versus Robert Gibson match in there.
Oh, you need one of those.
And you had the fantastic El Gigante versus the one-man gang.
I want the belt.
And you had Nikita Koloff versus Sting in a Russian chain match, which Nikita Koloff won.
Well, it's a Russian chain.
Well, yeah. So overall, that is a classic show. Overall, but what are some of your favorite memories of angles on television
from back in those days? I would say, oh man, early on, I was a big NWA fan, so I loved their stuff. With the Horsemen, before they became the Horsemen, the whole Magnetier versus Nikita Koloff,
big deal.
That was. And it's one of those things that, granted the car accident changed everything, but it was such a good series because when you build up a heel and let them be powerful and bad, you don't have that, well, they've got to cheat to win. Like, it's a bigger threat if they don't have to cheat to win. But so many times, like, companies just don't, invest in that. I remember that was a big one for me. Fantastics. Fabulous Ones versus the Moondogs. That was one of those financial news network shows I got to watch. I used to get every so often, I'd get a tape from a friend of like Caribbean wrestling. And one of my favorite things, and it's a gag I've used in the IWA, is someone being honored. And the Caribbean I think it's WWC is what they called it now, or back then. And it would be like, it's the rock and roll RPMs, and here's an award for being man of the year. This glass frame picture of him and the guy, right? And of course, someone comes out and smashes him over the head with it. It just was always like, oh, if a trophy's out, it's getting broken over somebody's head. If it's a cake, someone's eating it in the face. Always.
Again, television in terms of wrestling is so different back then than it is today. I mean, with your Monday Night Raw, you have your SmackDown. You even have your Ring of Honor wrestling. There's New Japan wrestling, if you can find it. Lucha Underground, if you can find it. But when you had national syndicated programming like Vince did, and they were all basically squash matches. Now, your prime times would have your shows from the house shows. They wouldn't run much angles. All your angles were running off of superstars. And that basically continued into the mid-90s. Even when Raw first started, it wasn't the A show yet. Superstars was still the A show because that was in every market, local television, every city in the United States, and also internationally syndicated. So they would see it in England, they would see it in Canada, they would see it this place and the other place. But I think the format of wrestling is very different. So when you had an angle, and a lot of people say that these angles lasted a long time, but for example, the Andre the Giant Hulk Hogan feud started
Yeah.
in February. The match was in March. Yeah, like 4 weeks.
Yeah.
But it seemed like it was so much longer because the way they did the television is that they would recap it on every single show, and then they
Yep.
would add a small piece. So it would be, oh, we're going to review all the Piper's Pits leading up to that, and then they would add another piece to the overall story. So it played out much longer. At least it felt that way. Now you
Yeah.
did have your feuds like Macho Man and Hogan, which that story ran a year, but no one knew that was a feud until February, right before WrestleMania, when
Yep.
Akeem threw Savage out and hit Elizabeth. So again, they had a month to prep that. So it wasn't like these feuds were lasting, longer. And, a lot of people criticize that all these feuds, they end so fast. There's a pay per view every month, but that wasn't the case in the WWF back in the day either.
Yeah.
NWA was a little bit different. Their feuds ran a little bit longer, and they would add layers on it. So you had Flair and his storyline angle that he was the world champion. That was his angle.
Yeah.
So in a given promo, he would call out Ricky Morton, Road Warrior Hawk, Dusty, Magnum, because he was wrestling all these guys, regardless. So again, television is very different. Cable's where it's at today, but I think that's going away in the future. I think everything's going to be kind of your Netflix, YouTube model, where if
Yeah.
you want to watch something, you can be able to stream it. They have the network already. I mean, that's there and it's going. So I think overall, it's going to be more streaming television. You're able to watch when you want to watch, it. And that's the way it's going to be from here on out, I believe.
I will say this: one of my favorite angles or series of angles, and this is kind of going a little bit in the extreme area, was the heel turn in a little known but very well watched organization called the Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling. I mean, Hollywood and Vine, wow, sign me up. My favorite though was the terrorist Palestina.
Mm.
Oh, what a rack! I'm just gonna. And the best thing was she was just such a great heel. Like she got into it, and the wrestling was awful. But I can't think of her name in WWE. But Nina Ferrari was her name there.
Was it Ivory?
Yes.
Yeah.
And her heel turn was awesome. It was like, no, it wasn't quite Barry Windham, but that was fun. I liked watching Glow. It was always a good time. It's one of those things that you forget about it almost. But there was some they try to do angles, and of course those terrible Vegas audience and David McLean.
AWA tried to run Vegas too, and those crowds weren't. They were.
Yeah. Well, that was just people like drunks from the casino.
Yeah.
Gorgeous ladies of wrestling.
I watched the tape once and I couldn't get through it. I had a hard time. Not figuratively, but
Yeah.
figuratively. No, literally. Now, in terms of the big shows in the 80s, you obviously had your Superdome shows with Watts. You had your Texas Stadium with World Class. You have the Omni out of Atlanta. Crockett would run the Greensboro Coliseum.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, those shows would be kind of your pay-per-views of today.
Yes.
Those were the shows they were building to. So if you watch Georgia Championship Wrestling, they're always talking about Omni. And it's another thing that's different about television today is that the TV, for example, Superstars, and we use WWF as an example, when you're watching it in Los Angeles versus New York, they would have promos for your market. So Hogan would talk about Madison Square Garden. He would talk about the Meadowlands. He would talk about the Boston Garden. He talked about all the Northeast stuff on those shows. If you're on the West Coast, he was talking about the Cow Palace. He was talking about the Los Angeles Coliseum. He was talking about the Sundome, which I think is in Arizona. So it was very custom to your area. And if you watch some of these clips on YouTube, you'll see some of those local promos. And that's something they don't do very well. I think even when the WWE runs in New York, sometimes I miss it somehow because they don't promote well. They don't promote their house show business as well as they should.
Yeah, I think that happened is back in the day is like even now we'll have every so often. Like I know they're coming back in I think June, but I think it's like a triple threat match with Sheamus, Roman Reigns and I think AJ Styles, or it's some like weird three guys. But I think back in the day, like you said, like I think what they were doing was they were kind of testing out different results.
Yep.
And back then, people that weren't as obviously media savvy as they are nowadays. You can't get away with like a mock title change.
Yeah. They would even do matches and then like, oh, that was a really good match. We're going to put that on pay-per-view.
Yeah.
Or you guys have good chemistry in the ring. We're going to start a feud with you guys. And you don't really get to see that nowadays because everything seems to be taped. You got cell phone cameras. They're starting to tape house shows for the network. So it's very different in terms of the way they have to do their television. Now, I wish they had someone who would be continuity expert. I can take that job for WWE to make sure they don't do anything ridiculous in terms of overall continuity. Like I remember something ridiculous where I think it was like Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio were feuding one week and they're tag team partners the next week, and that completely drove me completely insane because they just turned to these guys and I'm like, what are you doing? They were just killing each other over a kid like literally a week ago, and now they're friends. It's so so bizarre. No, I think the biggest feuder angle was the Andre the Giant versus Hulk Hogan. Now that dominated television in early '87 to the point where everyone knew about that match. And again, it did your 90,000, Silver Dome. Yeah. That number is debated on, but what have you. There was that TV. There's a penetration on that TV that they finally went national. There were 100% penetration in North America. And that's literally a lot of people, especially of my generation, that was the first angle they saw, was that Andre versus Hogan. So that was their introduction to professional wrestling. And the way it was shot, the way it was recapped, all that kind of stuff, it's something you don't really see to an extent today, where, you had all squash matches, you had a recap, and that's it. That's all you had on TV.
Yeah.
Today, for example, we just saw a 6-man match with, Roman Reigns, the Usos, versus, the Bullet Club, or the Club, if that's what they're calling them, I think.
Yeah.
And that was your main event of a Raw. And you would never, ever see that. That might have been a main event for a pay-per-view or a Saturday night's main event, but you wouldn't even see that on a weekly television show. So what do you think the overall effect of not having the squashes and having these star versus star matches, how's that, would it be positively or negatively impacted the wrestling industry?
Well, I think the thing with squash matches is it goes back to when they used to actually start establishing wrestlers. They wouldn't just have like Outback Jack show up. You'd have a couple of vignettes, then he'd beat a couple of jobbers, and then they'd have them kind of go up the ladder. And now they often have them come in, and they go right after somebody, and it's like, okay, like just injecting this guy into the mix, and there's no real build-up, so you don't have that. And squash matches, I think, served as a way to sell the move as devastating,
Right.
And now it's like everyone gets out of everyone's finisher pretty much, so it doesn't quite have the same appeal anymore. It just to me it kills the finishers. And you're left with like, well, that's it.
I think one of the negative aspects of it is that all the wrestlers that you promote have fans, right? So Tyler Breeze has fans. Do Tyler Breeze fans want to watch Raw where he's losing on every single Raw every week?
Right.
No, let's get this guy some wins on here. Because you're disappointing somebody. Zack Ryder has fans. Anyone on the lower end of the card right now, they all have fans because they market them as superstars. Now, how am I supposed to believe that these guys are superstars if they're getting beaten to dust, week after week? They might as well be job guys. They might as well have no character and no name. So they have to be very careful about that, especially if they're marketing these guys. Especially the way they're releasing guys. Now, you heard about Damian Sandow getting released this week.
Yep.
Which is a shame, but what are you going to do if they wasn't going to use anything, with them? What are you going to do?
Well, I think it's a double-sided sword. And the one you go, oh, they're losing in WWE, but like look at Drew Galloway, formerly Drew McIntyre. He was doing 3-man band job matches, not going anywhere. And I think what happens is it shows that you're actually better off if you look at like Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn, Cesaro. You're kind of better off really forming your character and identity outside of the WWE because they are not really shown to have the ability to create stars anymore.
Right.
I mean, how many stars in the last, let's say, 5 years can you think of that are WWE bred stars that came to power and you're like, wow, that guy's got it? Outside of the Shield, and Seth Rollins,
And two out of those three guys were made on the Indies anyway.
Right.
You know what I mean?
But I'm saying, like, they weren't the Shield. Like I'm saying, like, it's better for guys to identify, form their identity and all that stuff on the internet, independent circuit, and not hope that they get there and they're going to be like, don't worry about it, we got it.
Well, now that it seems like the WWE is more open to that, so they're bringing these indie stars and these international stars in. Names intact, character intact, moveset slightly altered, but for the most part, they are who they are. Austin Aries is Austin Aries, Samoa Joe is Samoan Joe. Finn Balor is pretty much Prince Devitt with a different name. So I think that's a positive way where like a guy that just got released, like Alex Riley, can go back, in the indies, or he wants to go to New Japan and create a new character. And now they have the ability now to bring this back to WWE. If you look at Luke Gallows, the guy that was released 6 years ago, he was able to go to Japan, he was able to go down to the indies, create a new character for himself, and now bring it back. And now they're taking him back. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Or they're going to get him. He's like, oh, he did such a great job. We love this character. We're going to bring in this deal. So I don't think it's the last we'll see of Damian Sandow. I can see him revamping his gimmick on the independents or in TNA or in Japan, and they can bring him back down the road.
Right, and I think he's a good example of a guy who, and this isn't a knock, it's just a guy who's so eager to be on TV and be part of the product that he'll take any bone they throw him. Remember when he was doing all those different gimmicks every week?
Yeah.
And it was kind of funny for a while, but it exposed the fact that they don't always have the magic touch. And the fans liked him.
The fans were very upset that they released them. They were like, oh, they misused them, which to an extent, yeah, that's probably true. But you don't know what kind of ideas that he was giving them. Maybe he had nothing also. And sometimes you have to go out and make yourself. You can't wait for a writer or writers to go out and give you a character. You have to go out there and kind of get it yourself. And some of these guys are not willing to put in that kind of work. Not saying that he is, but, I don't know. If he was pitching ideas and that kind of stuff. Wade Barrett, we knew about. He was leaving. He didn't want to renew his contract anyway, so they released him.
Yeah.
I think Cameron, they released. Hornswoggle, they released.
Yeah, Hornswoggle. Come on. No, not that.
Zeb Coulter, they also released as well. Good old Dutch. I'm surprised they didn't give him a creative position. Or maybe he didn't want it. You never know. Maybe they did offer it to him because he booked in TNA. He was the booker for the good parts of TNA, I believe. So, and he also booked in Puerto Rico for Carlos Colon in the WWC. So, I'm surprised they didn't use him. But who knows? Who knows? Maybe I might actually go see him. They're doing an autograph signing in New York in November. So
yeah,
maybe I'll just ask him when I see him. I really liked Dutch in that character, that Zeb Coulter character. I thought it was really cool. I mean, they didn't really had anything good for him to do because the managers nowadays are not really used as well as they possibly should.
Yeah.
For the exception of Heyman, but Heyman I think is the exception, not the rule there.
Yeah.
I wish they could do. I mean, I know they tried to put other wrestlers with them. I know they tried to put Kurt Hennig's kid with them at one point, and that didn't do anything. He actually did the stuff with Punk. I don't think they're going to do a staple or anything with Heyman. I think he's going to just do Brock, and that's it. And they can come in every once in a while and kind of do the deal there. So interesting times in the world of professional wrestling, as always. But in terms of this project, I just want to get a couple of things out of the way with this. Like I said, this is our national show that's on ESPN. Again, this would be the pilot, so that's why you see a lot of main eventers on this show as we go through it. So this will be the first one. Again, I want to present ESPN with, this is what we have to offer. Go forward there. Hopefully, in terms of going national, we grow along with ESPN is kind of the deal there. Now, the first market that we're really going to try to conquer would be, the Los Angeles area. So if Vince is in New York, I want to be in LA. We want to have a separation there. LA is still a big enough market, one of the biggest markets, I believe only second to New York, that we can get a foothold in early. At this point, Vince is not touring in California whatsoever. And I think that for the project and trying to go national and beat, Vince to the punch, I think conquering Los Angeles is a big deal. NWA still has a strong hold in Los Angeles with the LaBelles for the most part. And if you want to go into the Cow Palace, you can go into the Cow Palace. There's still rabid wrestling fans there that would like that NWA style. So I could put on Brody versus Abby in there. and have that be a quality match and have, draw a good house over there without, much of anything else. Now, guys, going forward, please, in the comment section, if you want to see any particular matches, I can try to accommodate those matches. If you have any comments, please leave a comment and please subscribe. Don't forget, super important. I'm going to try to get these out once a week for you guys, and check out the matches. As we get past the first week, again, we still have a couple more shows to do. We still have Mid-Atlantic with the Crockett's to do. We still have World Class to do, and we still have World Championship Wrestling, Georgia Championship Wrestling, whatever you want to call it, to round out the first week of the project, and it'll lead into our big show in St. Louis, Wrestling at the Chase. Will be our first, closed circuit pay-per-view like event. Again, with the way the territories work, there will be a closed circuit big event every week. Now, you might say, hey, that's crazy. How are you going to have a pay-per-view type show every week? Well, you got to understand, we still don't have 100% national penetration. So these shows may be blacked out in certain areas. So they may not see the St. Louis show in Memphis. So we still have to have a big show in Memphis because it's super important to protect that core territory. So when we talk about national expansion, the first thing we have to do is make sure that the core territories are protected. As I'm in charge of the expansion, so we're going to start in Los Angeles, and then we're going right into the Northeast, right after that, and the beginning of '84. So those are the plans upcoming. So be aware of that. Stay tuned for that. I think that's going to be great. And Matt, you have anything to leave us on this evening?
No, I would say just don't be afraid to suggest a match. You think you may not have the guy. Suggest whoever you like.
Yep.
And let's mix it up and see what happens.
Absolutely. So, guys, thank you for listening once again. I will see you next time on the